In this edition of CM Tools Masterclass, we're going to be using the Brazil CM synthesizer in order to create a fantastic drone-based patch, but one that utilizes the onboard sequencer to create all sorts of modulation and movement. But before we can get into that, we need to initialize the plugin so that we have a default patch to work to. We do this by going to the plugin window at the top, click and come down to Initialize or Init at the bottom, and when you select that, it should initialize and default the plugin. Part of the initialize actually leaves the effects switched on, so come down to the right hand side where it says Effects Delay and just switch that effect off so we don't get any further complication from the effects section. We'll begin creating our sound by going to the Oscillator 1 section and starting with the tune pot, which is at the top on the left hand side. Click and hold on the tune pot and drag it to the 12 o'clock position. And just a little reminder, anytime you make an alteration to one of the pots on screen, look at the display at the very top and it'll give you an accurate value or numeric. We also want to thicken the waveform that we're currently hearing from Oscillator 1, and we do this by going to the PD pot, which you'll find halfway down the channel strip on the right. Click and hold and drag this up to a value of 36.50. You should now hear a sound like this. Our next task is to patch in the filter. And in order to do this, we need to unpatch the output of the oscillator, which is currently going directly into the output itself. Move up to the Output 1 section, click and hold on the cable which is currently patched in, and you should be able to utilize that cable and plug it straight into the filter. We then have to reattach the output from the filter, going to the output section itself. We do this by selecting the filter type that we'd like. We're going to use the LP6, that's low pass 6 filter type, so click and hold on the output point and drag it into the input point on the output 1. We should now hear that the filter is very much in play. Let's make a couple of adjustments to the filter section itself, beginning with the cutoff control. We're going to set this to a value of 58 and then adjust the resonance value to a value of 41. Now it's time to head to the sequencer section, which you'll find at the very bottom of the plugin window. One of the most unique things about the sequencer which is on board this synthesizer is that we can use the sequencer multiple times to perform multiple tasks. We're going to use the first 4 faders in the sequencer for the first part of this patch, and we do this by going to the output point which is just above the 4th fader. Click and hold on this patch point and drag the attached cable up to the phase distortion modulation pot, which you'll find in Oscillator 1. Once attached, then turn up the modulation pot to a value of 70. We can now adjust the faders in the sequencer section, remembering we're only using the first 4 to begin with. You can set the value for these faders to whatever you want, but for the purposes of what we're doing here, we're going to start with a value of 0 on fader number 1, a value of 20 for fader number 2, a value of 32 for fader number 3, and finally a value of 24 for fader number 4. We currently have the sequencer set to what's known as gate trigger mode. That means that when we press a note, the sequencer starts scrolling. Let's now make a second connection from our sequencer to another part of the synthesizer. Move to the second patch point that we have on the sequencer, and we're going to drag a cable from this patch point up to the filter section and one of the filter modulation pots. We're going to set this modulation pot to a value of -40. As it currently stands, when we play a note, the sequencer starts to play. But one of the unique things we can do is change the timing element. So just above the second bank of 4 faders, you can see that there is a number 1. We're going to change that using the drop-down that's available to a number 4. This means that whereas the first sequencer section will scroll in time as it did before, you'll now see that the second sequencer section scrolls 4 times slower. But we haven't actually changed any of the fader settings yet in the sequencer, so consequently it's not doing anything yet. Let's try adjusting these faders to the following settings. We'll leave the first fader, which actually is the 5th fader, to a value of 0. Then the next fader we'll set to a value of 40. The next fader we'll set to 22. And the 8th fader in line we're going to set to 52. This now means we get a sound like this. and you can hear the second bank of faders is affecting the filter cutoff. Next, we're going to use the last bank of faders, but we're going to use all 8 at the same time. This means that we want to move to the very last patch point in line and click and hold so that we have a virtual patch cable. However, this patch cable is going to go into what we call a lag generator. The lag generators are over on the far left-hand side, and we're going into the top lag generator as marked. We then need to take an output from the lag generator, which we're going to plug into the second filter modulation pot in the filter section. So you might be asking what a lag generator does. Well, in essence, instead of going in a step-like fashion that we've previously heard on the sequencer, what the lag generators do is create a sort of portamento movement between each of the fader's settings. So what we can do is dictate how long it takes to get from one setting on the sequencer to the next. We do this by adjusting the attack and release phases of the lag generator. So start by setting the attack phase to 2.3 and the release phase to 1.6. We'll also need to make 2 other settings. First of all, we need to dictate the amount of modulation in the filter. We're going to recommend a value of something in the region of around about 66. And then if you start moving the faders that you have on the sequencer, you'll hear that pattern in the faders reflected in the cutoff. So we're not going to prescribe any particular settings for that part of the sequencer. We're going to invite you to make your own settings, but you can see the kind of thing that we're doing here. The more exaggerated you are from one step to the next, the greater the effect is likely to be. Next, we're going to utilize oscillator 2 to provide a form of sub-oscillator. We're going to patch the output from oscillator 2, which is at the bottom of the oscillator strip on the right-hand side. We're going to patch that straight into output 1. We're not going to take this particular oscillator via a filter. We are, however, going to turn the volume down to a value of 30. Move to the phase distortion control, which is labelled PD in the centre of the channel strip, and change that pot to a value of 50. You'll then hear a sound like this. And you can hear the sub-oscillator element rumbling away below the main element that we've already created. But the modulation doesn't end there. We're going to use envelope 2 to modulate the phase distortion element of oscillator 2 for even more modulation and effect. So take the output from envelope 2 and drag it to the phase distortion modulation pot. Once connected, set this pot to a value of 38. And the last thing we need to do is make some subtle alterations to both of our envelopes. You'll notice that envelope 1 isn't actually patched to anything. This is because it's hardwired to output 1, which is in effect controlling the volume of the patch. We can, however, change the 4 phases of the envelope so that it's a little more appropriate for our needs. Let's set the attack phase to a value of 12. The decay phase we're going to leave at a value of 50. Sustain phase we'll also leave at a value of 100. And the release phase we're going to set to a value of 14. Then coming across to envelope 2, we're going to change the attack phase to a value of 50, which is halfway up. We're going to set the decay phase to a value of 60. Set sustain to a value of 22. And then finally the release phase we'll leave set to a value of 20. This means that envelope 1 is controlling the amplitude or the volume of our sound, but envelope 2 is modulating the phase distortion of oscillator 2. This means that we now have a sound like this. So we've got tons of movement coming from both the sequencer and some subtle modulation coming from envelope 2 as well.